Comics panel. I will be your moderator today. I'm Paul Benjamin. I live here in Austin. How am I diverse? Strangely enough, I'm a Jewish person working in comics. An industry that was founded by Jewish people, but like strangely devoid of them to a large extent now, both in characters and in creators. But I also think that it is important as a white male for me to do whatever I can to help embrace diversity, because diversity is good. Sorry, spoiler. Everybody up here probably thinks diversity is a good thing. But I don't want to speak for them. We'll go down the row and I'll let everybody introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about what they do. Oh, I guess I should mention I've written a lot of like Marvel, Hulk, Spider-Man, Wolverine, Muppets, Monsters Inc., World of Warcraft, StarCraft, all kinds of fun, great things. And my own original series, Pantheon High, about a high school for demigods in present-day Los Angeles. And also, I'm running the auction for the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund in honor of Will Eisner's birthday. So if you have a chance, you can go bid on some cool jam pieces that all the artists here this weekend have been doing little pieces on. So they're very cool, probably over by my table 45.
Hi everyone, I'm Marissa Louise. I'm a colorist, but I'm here because I run June, which is a nonprofit supporting underrepresented communities in comics. So you'll see June events, that's J-O-O-N. You'll see June events at different conventions, and what those are events where people who have sort of invisible challenges to networking can network in a comfortable environment.
I'm Isaiah Broussard. I'm a cartoonist. I write and draw Transaltown as well as Crackers and White Wine, which is a hard-hitting political satire. I also draw Fight School, High School, and Help Wanted.
Hi, my name is Sophie Goldstein. I guess I'm one of those Jews still working in comics. I recently had a book come out called The Evan from Ad House Books. I'm also working on House of Women. Part 1 and Part 2 are available. Part 3 is coming out soon. And I did a webcomic called Darwin Carmichael is Going to Hell.
Hi, I'm C. Spike Trotman, usually just Spike. I am the founder and owner and pretty much only person running Iron Circus Comics, which is Chicago's largest comics publisher. I am probably best known for Smut Peddler, which is an anthology of erotica by women for everyone that is sex positive, and probably best known for being a Kickstarter early adopter. I launched my first project in 2009 when the site premiered, and caught a lot of flack for it from people who then quietly launched Kickstarters 3 years later. To date, I think my latest Kickstarter closed at like 161,000, and that means I guess I've made like $660,000 on Kickstarter in comics since I began using the site, and I've used it all to build Iron Circus Comics into what it is today. But before that, I did a webcomic called Templar Arizona back when, instead of Kickstarter would destroy your career, webcomics would destroy your career. So my entire pedigree is things that I shouldn't do because they'll destroy my career.
Yeah, I thought this whole path of self-destruction that these young folks are doing sounded wonderful. So my name is Gene Ha. I've worked over 20 years, mostly inside of Big 2 DC and Marvel Comics, and then decided to toss that overboard very late to the party, do a Kickstarter for an indie book about 2 girls going on adventures in a fantasy world somewhat like Oz. And it's been great fun. And let me see. Yeah, do not want to live in a comic industry where we are a bunch of old white and Asian guys manning the barricades to keep other people from buying our comics and reading comics with us. So that would be a sad, sad world.
And if you guys have questions as we go along, feel free to raise our hands. Somebody will bring you a mic and you can ask a question. That's a microphone, it's not somebody named Mike, just to be clear. So my first question for the panelists, and we can go down the row, or you guys can just speak up as you have an answer. I want to hear about your sort of first either positive or negative reaction to diversity in comics. So for example, I fell in love with Kitty Pryde because, hey, she's also Jewish, and she's my age, and she's a member of the X-Men, and she doesn't take crap from anybody, including Loki. This girl's pretty awesome. And so for me, I was like, ooh, a Jewish person in comics who's really cool, and that was really great. But there may have been other characters who you guys were like, really? That's the best representation we get? So take it away.
People are gonna think I'm lying, but I was never like really super huge into mainstream comics in general. So I never read X-Men type stuff. The closest I came to reading mainstream superhero stuff is I was reading Excalibur, but I was reading it in a very specific way where I'd pick up the issue and I'd check and see who was drawing Nightcrawler that issue. And I believe it's Alan Davis. If he was drawing Nightcrawler, then I would buy that issue. And if somebody else was drawing Nightcrawler, I would not buy that issue. So I was part of that crowd. Every time I mention this in any group of women who read comics, there's always like 2 or 3 people who go, oh yeah. Alan Davis Nightcrawler. Yeah. So that was me. But I fell off the superhero bandwagon entirely. I think it was Age of Apocalypse did it to me, where there was a thing Marvel did where you had to buy like 5 or 6 different titles to keep up with the story. And I was like a kid. I couldn't afford to buy 5 comics a month, so I just stopped reading comics altogether and actually fell out of it again until a few years later a friend lent me her copy of Strangers in Paradise. But like, getting back to the part people will say won't believe me. I do believe the first black woman I saw in a comic was Angel Food McSpade. So yeah, I was not a fan. If you're not aware, that's a Robert Crumb character. Oh. Yeah. And it's sort of a cartoon, like rubber inner tube lipped, coal black woman with like a little top knot on top of her head and like a grass skirt. Yeah, it's super unfortunate. And up until the 90s, I remember seeing like Angel Food McSpade stuff for sale in Tower Records. And I was like, okay, well, this is an industry that will never, ever take me seriously because they straight up make Angel Food McSpade candy bars and t-shirts and they're not even blinking about it.
Because I got the next, we'll make it linear after this. I'll just mention that Robert Crumb is a genius in so many ways, and he likes doing parodies of our racist attitudes that are so incredibly accurate that the KKK actually likes to distribute them, which is kind of like, yeah, you did too good a job there, man. Let me see. Now, just on a totally different note, my experience with diversity that kind of opened my eyes. Because I'm going to say, I got into comics in the 70s as a little kid, and things were not diverse back then. They were starting to get diverse, but they were not diverse. One of the things that opened my eyes and kind of inspired me to do my Kickstarter book eventually was reading, I got the worst memory for names in the world. Why I Hate Saturn by Kyle Baker, which was about 2 female characters written by a black guy. The characters were white, and it's kind of like, no, you can just do anything, and you can also do something that's kind of unrelated to who you are and make the comics world bigger and just learn about and explore things about people who are, just totally different than you and just expand your world and your mind. And it just, there's a thing that they say where they say, write what you know, which if you take it, if you don't think about it, can be very limiting. And you can take that also as an invitation, though, to know more and get to know more people. And once you actually know these people and talk to them, then you can tell their stories. But don't just, the problem you get with, the bigger problem with the thing they call appropriation is writing stories about people without finding out what their stories are. But if you're willing to learn the stories, you can just start writing about everybody. It's great.
For what it's worth, I think satire is something that questions the state of affairs instead of regurgitating it back even uglier than when it was originally consumed. So while I agree Robert Crumb is a good draftsman, and he's got the crosshatch game strong, like I'll never deny that, genius is definitely not a word I would use.
He's got storytelling chops.
but the way he uses them is not the way.
While
We're
we're
gonna
on
have to
that
disagree
segue,
on that one.
while we're on that segue of satire, I just want to say that satire is something that you have to come at with a lot of responsibility, because it's really, really easy for your message to get misconstrued. And if Crumb is, in fact, going for a message that questions the stereotypes and the racism of the day, doing it in a way where the message does not get conveyed does not do your message any justice at all.
Absolutely. It's like, I'm with him on this, that if it's indistinguishable from what it's parodying, I'm not sure it qualifies as satire anymore.
Yeah.
This is why I don't like Johnny Ryan.
So I come at it from a little bit of a different angle. I was raised in kind of a hippie family. I have a mixed race family. And so the thing that's amazing about cartoons is there's a thing called signaling, okay? So it's how you tell you're a part of a community, okay? And the way I was raised was very small, so I knew I wouldn't find other parts of my community out there, so I just sort of adapted to whatever was around me, and I had that luxury. But one thing I really loved about comics, because of my context of a mixed race family, I would just assume that, like, I always thought Doctor Strange was Persian, like, because my Persian uncles were doctors, my mom's a doctor, you know, so I was like, okay, like, it was never, like, he didn't really ever signal Persian that much, but a little bit here and there, and I was like, yeah, of course, this guy's Persian. And then somebody told me the other year that he was white, and I was like, what? And so the way I read a lot of comics was through that lens. But as I grew up and started reanalyzing things, I realized there was like a lot of missing signals, and it was my own projections. But I just want to tell you that is a possibility out there in the world.
I came into comics from watching cartoons as a kid, and the really big one for me was the X-Men. And you see, you got black characters like Storm there, and you got Bishop, and you have the Asian Jubilee. And I instantly felt really connected to that cartoon. Whereas growing up with other cartoons like the Ghostbusters, where the black guy's just kind of there, and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, where the only black character you really get is Bebop, who was allowed to be black for one episode before turning into a warthog. And I was very keen to notice certain things with the way that black characters were treated in cartoons in the media. I remember watching the Spider-Man cartoons, and you had Robbie in the Daily Bugle, who was this really, really good role model of a black character. But then the superhero characters that you had in the show were like Rocket Racer and the Prowler, who, although turning into superheroes, started off as criminals. And I just noticed a lot of that in the media when it came to black characters, that they had to have some sort of criminal or deviant background before, even Spawn, before they become some sort of heroic character. And that's what I really appreciate about the X-Men, because Storm didn't have that issue. Bishop was coming back to try to save his future. And other characters that were in the cast that were from different countries and from different races, all had a positive beginning. And I think that positivity is something that really inspired me to get into comics from there.
Has anyone here read the original run of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles? Okay, I had a cousin named Chris who was a teenager back when Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles were all red bandanas and fighting Triceratops from space and all that stuff. And I was very confused when the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles cartoon came on. I could understand why they changed the different colors of the bandanas to distinguish them, because that just made sense to me. But I remembered an April O'Neil who was kind of cafe au lait with kinky hair. And I'd read her as Hispanic because she looked like the Hispanic girls at my school. And when you're a child, you're not as aware as you normally are. But I remember thinking to myself, oh, I guess she's different now. I wonder why they changed her. And that's the kind of thing where I want the time portal to open and like 30-year-old me to come through the portal. Like, I'll tell you what.
So, quick question for the panelists. Arthur, you know the Arthur cartoon?
Yeah, with the aardvark, right?
Yeah. He's black, right? Like,
That's a little after my time. I didn't watch Arthur.
I just always thought he was Aardvark. I mean, Sonic was.
I'll tell you who's black.
Right?
Rolf
He's
the
a
dog is
hedgehog.
black. Rolf the dog's black. That's kind of the only sort of assigning of race to a puppet I've ever done.
Well, my earlier experience with diversity was a lack of diversity because I was kind of taught that the great comics were all made by men, and those are the kinds of comics that you should try to make. And I just didn't know about any female artists, and certainly any people of color, like even less so. And I remember when I was like 13, I was getting into comics, and my mom was like, "Oh, well, I'll find you a local artist, and to like you can take a little class and start drawing comics." And she found someone, a woman, and I did little comics, and I just remember her saying, "You draw too much like a girl," and I didn't draw comics again for like 10 years. Yeah, it was in retrospect, at the time I was like, I do draw too much like a girl. And I think it's that kind of like, the idea that, especially if you look at mainstream comics, and it took me a really long time to find indie comics, so a lot of it was mainstream comics, is that, like, that style is masculine and that you should draw like that. And there's even the idea of like, I don't know, there's a lot of things going on with that, but that finding comics that are female and not just in characters but in style and kind of like, that is okay. That there is an audience for that. There are women who read comics, and like you can make comics for that audience, and I mean, it's just now I feel like I'm in a completely different world than where I started with that. And I thought but recently the whole thing with the Angoulême Festival. Yeah, which, do any of you, I'm sure a lot of you are not aware of what.
Yeah, I was going to say you should elaborate on that.
Okay, so the Angoulême Festival is like the biggest comics festival in the world, and it happens in Angoulême, France. And it's a very big deal for all kinds of different publishers, French publishers, American publishers, English publishers, and people just like all go to this week-long comics festival. And they have a award that's like is it a Lifetime Achievement Award?
Yeah, basically.
Yeah, and they get together some judges and they nominate 30 people, and the people at the festival vote. And this past year, all 30 nominees were men. And when people kind of like were like, what is up with this? The organizer was like, well, there's just not that many women in the history of comics.
No.
If you go to the Louvre, you won't see many women there either.
Oh my god.
Or they say like all the women are on the walls or something. It's like, so.
When dudes control the art society.
Yeah, it was just one of those things. I actually,
Yeah.
I just, the red haze came down for a minute and I like lost an hour. And when I came back around, it was like I had like 15 tweets that were there. And it was just me going, yeah, women in comics, whoever fucking heard of such a thing? Picture of Sailor Moon. What woman makes comics? Picture of Ranma 1/2. Women in comics, how ridiculous. Picture of Kathy Guy Swide. Picture of, just a whole bunch of women cartoonists who, like, even if I'm not into what they do specifically, you cannot deny their lifetime contributions to comics. Like, I specifically avoided modern cartoonists I was super into. I was looking at it through the lens of they've been at it since forever. They've been at it since I was a twinkle in my father's eye. And somehow they don't count as worthy of a lifetime achievement. Sailor Moon basically destroyed an entire generation of girls. And even now, I look at the webcomics world and there's like 5 or 6 different magical girl remix kind of comics running right now, and that is directly responsible. Like, Sailor Moon is directly responsible for that kind of thing. And when you have that sort of worldwide global influence on young creators, and yet some asshole in France is like, well, women just don't achieve much. It's
I mean, like Full Metal Alchemist has changed the shonen game.
yeah, absolutely.
Well, so
Clamp, for God's sake!
that's an excellent transition because I wanted to ask where you're seeing a lot more diversity nowadays, right? So you've already listed off some things, but where are you guys? Sorry, see, I just said you guys. Where are y'all? Let me use the Texas positive statement. Where are y'all seeing great use of diversity?
Webcomics.
Tumblr is killing it right now. Just, most of them think to tag their uploads, so just go on Tumblr, search the webcomics tag. You will find what's going to be super hot in 5 or 10 years. There are 5 or 6 webcomics that I would name for you, but I'm afraid there are also people who are publishers in this room, and you might go after them too. But they're like on a special list where I send them love letters, where it's like, just so you know, you're amazing. Have you ever thought of having a print edition? Yeah, it's like, I think it's Scott McCloud who said that in 10, 15 years, he foresees a comics industry that it doesn't just have gender parity, it's going to be majority women. And it's one of those things where, yeah, I can see that, because the reason, in my opinion, there are so many women in comics right now, Tokyo Pop, I could go on about them, but their big contribution to the comics culture in America was they got a lot of comics in not comic book shops, in bookshops that were written with women and girl readers in mind. And there was a time when you couldn't go into Barnes & Noble and not trip over some kid sitting cross-legged on the floor power reading Fruits Basket because they couldn't afford all 15 volumes or something. And a lot of those kids grew up and they moved into the comics industry. And right now, those kids who are reading comics who are young, who are going to grow up and move to the industry, they're reading Smile, and they're reading Sisters, and they're reading Babysitter Club GNs, and they're reading Bone. And people already consider reading a feminine thing, which is ridiculous, but a lot of these books are by a woman or by women, and a lot of girls are reading them, so this is just something that's going to repeat itself. So in 10 years, I can totally see more comics like the ones I'm reading on Tumblr and on Twitter, and most of them are going to be by girls. I really think that.
I would also, I'm sorry, I think also in terms of diversity, there's kind of like 2 parts to diversity. There's diversity as in representation, as in the characters you see on the page, and then there's diversity in terms of the creators creating the comics. And I think the mainstream industry is kind of getting around having representation in the characters, but the creators are still just a white sea of males mostly. And but I think with the places where the bar to entry is lower, so there's not the gatekeepers and the handshaking in the darkness. So in Tumblr, of course, and then webcomics and indie comics where you're just doing self-publishing, you're going to see more diverse in creators, and I think that is, to me, that's the really important thing, because as a white person, I can draw a character who's not white, but I do not have that experience. I can't get into the mind space of that character the way that someone representing themselves in their work can do, and I think that is truly important.
There are a lot of things I see in mainstream comics, not going to name names, but there's a lot of things I see that would have never gotten out the door if a person of color had been in that room. And you can tell where the writing stable, I guess you could say, is all white, or at least does not have a person of color on it, or the writing stable is all male, because they're aware, diversity is a hot thing right now, everyone's trying to push comics forward, and they do something, and maybe it has well-meaning at its heart, but it's so underinformed and so clumsy, that there's no experience behind it, and worse than no experience, there's no research behind it.
A strange fruit.
Marvel hip hop variants while they have
Yeah.
very few black creators.
Let me just say there's a subtext in this where essentially it's not so much where do you find the diversity, it's where do you not find the diversity. And the big obvious place is essentially, let's just call it the Big Bang Theory crowd. The big two comic companies, DC and Marvel, there's a lack of diversity there. And shops that only focus on those two companies will often have no idea about the greater diversity of everywhere else. Where if I go to like, apparently, it's, the shops I've seen in Austin seem wonderful, and the shop owners around here. If I go to, I live in the Chicago area. If I go to Chicago proper and the good comic shops there, great diversity of material of all kinds.
Chicago Comics.
Yeah, Chicago
Quimby's.
Comics, Challengers, Quimby's. Oh yeah, Quimby's has enough diversity of topics where I cannot bring kids there.
Yeah.
I once did bring my kind of my niece there, and it's kind of like, oh god, we gotta go right back out that door. But if we go to the suburbs, and I've been talking about like, oh, you're trying to bring more kids and women into your shop as customers. Have you thought of like stocking books like anything by Raina Telgemeier? Who? Literally, I'm just like, I begin naming off these things. Have you heard of the Ambulance series?
Bestseller.
Yeah.
She's got 7 out of 10
Yeah.
of like the bestseller spots on like graphic novel right
Yeah.
now.
And I tell them, go to the independent bookstore across the street and 1 block over, and look at the graphic novel section. It's all there. And it's like, they had not heard of any of this stuff. This is so common. And then they talk, you know, a different shop, but in the suburbs, they began complaining to me about like, why is Marvel trying to push this all diversity stuff and I can't sell this stuff? And it's kind of like, that's because you're trying to sell to your current customer
And that's
base.
the
You're trying to
kicker
get new
too.
customers.
I used to hear all the time from comic book stores that, you know, minorities don't buy comics. Well, you know what? Growing up as a black kid in 3rd Ward of Houston, I bought plenty of comics. You know where I bought them from? The corner store. But they don't sell comics in corner store anymore. So comics are locked into these comic book stores that tend to only be in the suburbs in like middle and upper middle class areas where it's already gatekept from minorities. So yeah, they don't see minorities buying comics because they're not being supplied to minorities anymore.
Yeah.
Self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the first thing I want to say, and I think this is really important, is diversity has always been in comics, but it has been segregated from the mainstream in a way that makes it appear like it's not there. But it has always been there, and we're gonna remove a lot of invisible roadblocks to make it more welcoming. When I was living in Bed-Stuy, at the time it was a majority black community, and like all the kids read comics, and like they knew I had comics, so they come to me to get comics. And
You're
like,
their dealer? Did you give them their first comics
That's
free?
how it worked.
Yeah.
We give all our money out to the kid who was closest to the corner store and could go walk there, or anyone who had any kind of comics set up. It's like, hey man, can you get me that Spider-Girl this week?
But when I was growing up in Oregon, when I was like 10, right? The comic book store they're very different now. I want to say that they're very different now. But at that time, in the early 90s, a little girl going into the comic book store was awful, and they were not very nice to me. And I'm really glad things are changing. And I think when we're talking about diversity, it's important to remember that it exists, and if you're not seeing it, that's you. Like, because there are people out there, and especially with the internet now, and I'm hoping with June and these networking events, we are working to remove a lot of the forced invisibility of diversity.
One of the things that white supremacy and male supremacy does, one of the stories that it pushes, is that only white men have ever done anything. And it's this self-perpetuating thing because white men are in charge of X. So when they chronicle the history of X, they only care about other white men. So the history of X is written to include exclusively white men, and then 20 years later, white men post to the white male penned history of X, and so say, here is proof that only white men have ever done X. And people of color have always made comics. Women have always made comics. there's nothing unusual about people, like, it's almost offensive when people today act like all these women and all these brown and black people in comics are some kind of new thing, and like, we're barbarians at the gate here to ruin your beautiful culture. It's like, no, we have literally always.
And to help our stores sell more comics to
Yeah.
more people, how dare you?
Yeah, it's just kind of one of those things where, like, maybe we're not as quiet as we used to be, and maybe we're not as accepting of exclusion as we used to be, and we're way more vocally critical of how you function than we used to be.
We have
But
a
we've always been
question.
here.
Sorry, we have a question in row 4. I see a
Yeah,
hand.
There's been a lot of talk about diversity for years now, and lately I'm seeing more on Tumblr a word that I like better, and that's inclusiveness. And what you were just saying about exclusion, I think we need to bring that more into the discussion, that it's not like, oh, we have this diverse comic that we've got, or we've got black authors or whatever, so we're doing our diversity, but focusing on inclusiveness instead, and just saying, look, these people have always been here. Women have always been here, African Americans have always been here, gay people have always been here. Let's include them, as opposed to sort of segregating them off and like, this is our diverse area. So I was wondering if you guys could speak to that at all.
I also like that term inclusiveness because I think that it also contains the idea of not having representations that make people feel unwelcome. And which diversity, that word doesn't really contain that, because I think that's really important, you know, and you don't want someone to see themselves in a comic, as we've talked about, and then that first impression is like horrible.
I have to say, I would have probably lost my mind if Steven Universe came on as a child, and there was a superhero on TV who had an afro out to here, who was the coolest person on the show, in my humble opinion, who was complex and fun and a main character and did not have to justify her existence, and read as black.
To expand on that idea of inclusiveness and avoiding the idea of saying, here's our diversity section.
Yeah.
One of the things I find the most offensive is when it's very, very clear that a company goes, these are the black comics.
Yeah.
You know, these are the comics for women. These are the comics for Hispanics. You know, it's like, well, just write the books for everyone. If you've got a big team, put a little bit of everybody in there. But it's far more offensive to me to be segregated off into thinking, well, I have to like these characters, and here's the team of black guys that I need to read.
Yeah, it's a lot of it, there's a lot of marketing behind it, because marketing likes neat little pieces. And marketing is especially odious and strong these days with the pink aisle. You know what I mean? The idea that here's the girl show and here's the girl stuff, and the girl demographic will be shunted off here and the boy demographic will be shunted off here. And I'm sure a few of you have heard the story of Teen Titans, the cartoon that got canceled because too many girls liked it. Because this is what I have heard from the grapevine, where there was a Teen Titans show and it got canceled despite having good ratings because it was making the columns in the marketing department untidy, because girls wanted Teen Titans merchandise that was categorized as boy, and they weren't buying girl merchandise because there was no Teen Titan merchandise, because Teen Titans was a boy show. And it made things untidy, therefore they canceled Teen Titans.
Right here, second row.
Yeah.
So this is a bit of a two-part question. We're talking about the history and sort of the dark times of what has been, and seems to be a consensus it's getting better. Can you first speak to what are the events or what has happened that has made it get better, but where do we go from here? How do we get it from it's getting better to, okay, now we have inclusion?
The explosion of the small press and independent comic scene has like quadrupled sort of the inclusive factor in comics. I can remember when I would go to a comic show and I was the only black girl in a room, and now I'm far from the only black girl behind a table, which is really nice. There have always been gatekeepers in comics initially who were editors, and for many decades comics was very concerned about selling to the group that they had always sold to. So if an idea was submitted to them, the first hurdle it had to jump was, but does this play with 30 to 45-year-old white men who are middle class? And if the answer was no, your chances of being published at most of the large publishers was infinitesimally small. And the small publishers could only afford to publish so many books a year. And it was brutal if you were outside of this sort of superhero marketed like demographic in your intended audience. And now that no longer exists, basically. Kickstarter can fund the production of comics directly without interference of a publisher who has to worry about something like that. And Tumblr is an amazing way to get your stuff out there because all you have to do is remember to tag your uploads properly and people can just find it. And without this sort of curation by people who have motives that are part marketing, part good old boy, there's so much more diversity than there once was.
When I first got into the industry, it was about 1992, and it was at a time when there was a huge surge of actually a rather diverse group of 13-year-old kids and a little bit older getting into things like Wildcats and Spawn and stuff like this. And then comics stopped attracting new readers for about almost 2 decades, and it began dying, and these comic shops began becoming less and less inviting of places. The industry, I mean, you would not believe how many times every 2 years the comic industry almost collapsed. Every distributor used to be like 6 distributors. Now there's 1. You know, 2/3 of comic shops closed. Just all these horrible things. And it's like, I'm not going to be doing this job in 5 years. And then all the stuff she described happened, and some people said, we need to stop this now.
Yeah, there was a while there where it's like people would joke about comics are gonna die. Just kidding, not really. Comics are doomed. I'm making a joke. I'm really not. I'm terrified. I mean, it was like Marvel was declaring bankruptcy, and the black and white boom, it annihilated so many comic shops, and so many distributors went under. And I remember I made a tweet a while ago. One of the most important books in my life has been The Cerebus Guide to Self-Publishing. And it was a book I bought when I was a teenager, and I read obsessively because I decided as a teenager I was going to have to self-publish to get anything done. And it had a list in the back of distributors, and just for fun, looked up all the distributors, and then screenshotted the list of distributors and posted it to Twitter and went, out of business, now a trucking company, out of business, absorbed, collapsed, out of business, and just Diamond was the only one left. It was so bad. Like, it's hard to imagine, but people honestly thought comics were on borrowed time.
But if you look at just at this table, just looking at Jean, who you were talking about getting into this industry in the early 90s, and now you, who have worked for many years for Marvel and DC, you're doing exclusively your own book, right? You're not doing Marvel and DC stuff right now.
I'm open to it if I ever have enough time away from doing my own book, but just
Right.
it's not, yeah. I mean,
But
the
you're
money-
able to just focus on your own book, which
Yeah,
you weren't able to do 5-10 years ago.
Oh no, yeah, this would have been. It's possibly doable, but it's so much easier now, and just so much easier to get word out through the new channels, and there's just huge new audiences, and also a big part of this is I don't want to be part of the diseases that are killing comics.
Yeah.
And if I just kept on doing the same old superhero books and the same old characters aimed at this, this is a role-playing game term, at the same old grognards, comics would die.
Deep
Yeah.
cut.
Do you guys know the Battling Boys story? Okay, there is this cartoonist named Paul Pope, and there was a character that he wanted to resurrect. It was an old Kirby character, Kamadi, I believe is how you pronounce it.
No.
Kamadi or Kamadi, the last boy on Earth.
I think come on.
Kamandi, the last boy on Earth? Yeah, and he approached a publisher and said, hey, yeah, you guys have the rights to this character, and I would like to resurrect it. And he kind of went through the whole pitch, like, this is what I'd like to do with the character, I think it'd be really fun, blah, blah, blah. And the person he was talking to went, who is the intended audience for this book? And he was like, you know, like 12-year-old boys? And the publisher went, we don't make comics for 12-year-old boys, we make comics for 42-year-old men.
Oh.
And he was like, oh. And so instead of getting the rights to Kamandi, excuse me, he made Battling Boy instead, because,
It's amazing.
yeah, it's good.
You know, one of the worst experiences I ever had, I was on a panel. I was the only black person. It was a bunch of old hat white dudes. and it was supposed to be about writing, and they ended up complaining a lot about the state of the industry instead. And yeah, I got talked over a lot. It was very fun time. But here I am, the only web cartoonist there on the panel about these guys that were super obsessed about doing things the old way and about publishing the old way. And I'm just like, you guys tried interneting yet? Because it's so much more diverse in the small publishing crowd and in the self-publishing crowd and in the webcomic crowd than it is out there trying to work with the big two or trying to publish in the old ways where it's gated by people who already have money and capital, which tend to be older white men. And I just feel that even though things are getting better with diversity, that at the end we just can't trust it to the big comic book companies
Yeah.
to do it.
Yeah.
Support indie comics. There's so many diverse creators doing things independently, doing things on the internet, doing things at a small level. And that's becoming more and more of a force that the larger companies can't ignore anymore. And so they're kind of, as to say, jumping on the bandwagon that the smaller guys are creating.
200-year-old joke, very quick. Yes, a line, joke from the French Revolution of the man in the suit following the mob saying, "There goes the people, I must follow them so I can lead."
Yeah, in all honesty, one of the, again, I'm gonna keep talking about Kickstarter because I'm basically evangelical about that site. It has made my publishing company, it has made my career, and I see a lot of people using it now how I was using it like 3 or 4 years ago, and I'm all for it, I love it. And one of the things you see a lot on Kickstarter are books that I couldn't imagine in 100 years flying with larger publishers or even mid-sized publishers. Like, hey, I want to do a queer paranormal romance anthology. It's on Kickstarter. Hey, you know what I want to do? I want to do a story about a non-binary asexual guy's adventure in queer culture. It's on Kickstarter. And these are the kind of things that you can't tell yourselves people don't want them. I mean, that's kind of the story in publishing when stuff is denied. Well, there's no audience for this. Really? Because 3,000 people just bought it on Kickstarter. So when you say there's no audience in this, what do you really mean? Because what you've told me is provably untrue.
Yeah, to add to that, I think that with there's a lot of big stars right now in indie comics who are women. I would say like when you go to a show like SBX, like it's dominated by these women.
Not a mistake, not a coincidence.
But I think that one of the things that's still happening is that publishers will only publish these people after they've proven that they've already gotten their audience before their first book deal. Like Kate Beaton is published by John Corley, but she had a massive following before that happened. Raina Telgemeier, she had been doing comics before. She'd been drawing other properties, but her book Smile was a webcomic with a following before it got picked up as a book. Like, people need to prove themselves as viable before publishers will consider picking them up.
And I want to talk again a little bit about accidental this time instead of forced invisibility, and what the internet does to remove that. So imagine like a half Jewish, half Chinese kid in Ames, Iowa, right? They probably feel pretty alone out there, but when they get on the internet, they can find their community and they can find their market. Now, if you're a marketer, you see this one blip, and it's like, why would I do that? But what they don't see is there's like one blip here, one blip in Alaska, one in Australia, one in New Zealand, and they're all over the world. And even though you can appear to be alone, you are rarely alone. And thank heaven for the internet now, because it's really unbelievable the peers I thought I'd never get a chance to be around.
Do we have more questions?
I saw someone
Oh yeah, question.
Yeah, I did have one.
She's been waiting for ages.
I have a question about
Go ahead.
creation.
Oh.
So I, my area of interest happens to involve history a lot, and so I like to, just look up a lot of cool topics that are relevant today, but historical, like in historical settings. And this usually involves, European-centered things in some way or another. And I realized the other day that when I was just drawing whatever, 16th century X, that I had a lot of ideas about Ottoman Empire stuff and North Africa stuff, but which I have read a lot about and studied in college and know about, but it felt wrong to write about that because somehow European history is up for grabs and other things that are not my own. I'm Mexican, so it's not my culture. But so about the cultural appropriation thing, you should write about what you know. So I'm just wondering what y'all think about that.
I think when people go write about what you know, they have taken it way too literally. When people say write about what you know, it doesn't mean literally only write about people exactly like you who have lived your life. I think that's an idiotic interpretation of the term, but I think it's a way too common one. Cultural appropriation is one of those things where there are very fuzzy borders on it. There are extremely fuzzy borders on it, and I don't want to live in a world where I can only write about people exactly like me or else get accused of being appropriative. The thing that makes something appropriative, in my mind, is its divorce from context and its treatment as an accessory. And I think a good example of it maybe would be which Star Wars was it? But Queen Amidala, where basically someone did a copy-paste on Mongolian wedding hairdos, and just went copy-paste, and it was suddenly on Amidala's head with absolutely no alteration whatsoever. And I was like, that is really lame. There's inspiration, and then there's just theft. And to me, that felt really inappropriate. But at the same time, if I wanted to do a comic about, I don't know, the shogunate era of Japan or something, what I would do is I would approach it from a respectful angle. I would do all the research I could. I'd make sure it was as accurate as I could make it. And I would do it with the knowledge that people would complain anyway, no matter how hard I tried. Because the story that I like to tell is in Temple, Arizona, the webcomic I originally did, there was a character named Scipio. He was a 6'10" tall black man who wore a kilt and was Zen Buddhist, and he was really, really, really into kung fu television shows aimed at children. So he was kind of weird. Also, he had a pet chicken, but anyway.
I grew up with that guy.
Yeah, so to this day I kind of refer to him as a stealth dork, because he was very cute and he was very handsome and tall and rugged, but then he opened his mouth and all he wanted to talk about was that world's equivalent of Power Rangers. So it's like, okay. But anyway, one of the first criticisms my comic got online was whoever is doing Temple, Arizona has never met a black person in their life. Black people don't do that. Black people don't act like that. This is a white person's idea of what black people do. This is someone who's afraid to write a real black person. And to this forum's credit, someone immediately responded to that post with one sentence, no punctuation, no capitalization, which was just, "Wow, look how dumb you are." And a photo of me from the author's page of the webcomic. So it's like, if I can't get over on that, if someone's going to come after me for doing inaccurate black people, there's no hope for you whatsoever. Except that there's going to be criticism. It's just that not all criticism is valid. A lot of criticism is bullshit, and quite frankly, I think there are elements of the internet, not all but some, that kind of keep score. And they do performative progressiveness. And they're going to try and score points by criticizing you if you come into their line of sight. And what they say will be invalid, and you will know that because you will know you researched it, you're treating it respectfully, and you're coming from it of an angle of a person who wants to portray it accurately. And that's the best you can do.
Let me just add on also, if you want to write something about, like, say, Mameluke Egyptian history, track down people on the internet, or friends if you can find them locally, who are actually Egyptian and comic geeks or whatever. And they will be so happy that somebody wants to tell their story. Just run it by them and find out what their current interpretation, understanding of their own culture and history is. And you know, it's, I am writing about female geeks right now. I'm not a female geek. And I will talk to my female geek friends and just ask them stories about their, you know, their own experiences. And they'll tell me these stories like, oh my God, I could build 5 issues off that. And they're like, oh, I can't imagine that'd be a story. It's kind of like, how? That's fascinating. That's,
Yeah.
anyway.
Nuggets of authenticity, when readers read them, they really appreciate it, so.
There's nothing more heartbreaking to me than when a creator really is passionate about telling a story that has diversity and inclusivity, and they are being turned off from it from being afraid of the reactions of others.
Yeah,
But don't be afraid to do something positive.
yeah.
Speaking to that real quick, if you're afraid, you're probably doing it right. If you're very confident, you need to stop what you're doing right now, put down your pen, and talk to some people that live the culture, because you are probably really screwing up. One of the guiding lines I personally use for deciding what's appropriation, because it's very fuzzy, it's very challenging, but it's the level of exploitation and reward,
Yeah.
right? So if you're getting disproportionate reward from the stories of the people you're telling their stories, then that is a warning sign that you need to reassess how you're doing things.
I struggle with this too, but specifically, not quite in the same terms, but in terms of artistic influences. My book, House of Women, I started off wanting to do it in Art Nouveau style, but Art Nouveau is itself derived from, you know, Anglos looking at Japanese prints that were coming in the early 1900s. And so then I was looking at those prints and kind of like using those influences in my own art, and you know, and I question my own motivations or how I use these things and stuff like that. But at the end of the, you know, and when I talk about it, I very openly like cite all the stuff that I was looking at. But you know, if I just restrict myself as an artist to only being influenced by white Jewish people, I would have a lot of cartoons to look at. But those are
But there will be a lot of klezmer music.
but that's not the stuff
But I
that
love klezmer music.
interests and excites me. And I think that you kind of have to like follow your passion, but in a responsible way.
Yeah, if you're passionate about it, that's a great sign.
Yeah.
Let's make sure we get your question in, since we stole the mic from you earlier.
No, it's fine. I actually did see her, so I'm glad to give it up to her. But I'm wondering, because I take it for granted that all artists are going to make whatever it is they're going to make because they want to make it. It's ultimately for you first, but in part because we live in a capitalist society, in part because comics are a consumable medium and they will have more meaning if they have an audience. I just wonder, how important is it before you start to make it, or while you're making something, that you have an audience in mind and who that is?
I don't care.
No,
No,
you don't care.
just personally.
I don't care either.
Honestly, if you see me making a comic, it's because I want to make it, and if I happen to have a large audience for it, like Smut Peddler has found its audience. I thought it was, I knew I wasn't alone. I knew there were women out there who were just fucking porn freaks just like me. Because we would swap the names of artists. It's like, here's a good artist. They do femdom, and it doesn't end with the woman getting punished for taking control. So this is a real, bookmark this one. So I know those people were out there, but I was already into it. So, you know, I'm going to make the stuff I want to make, and if it finds an audience, awesome. I don't sit there and kind of have the Garfield approach where I look through the paper and I go, there's no cat strip, there should be a cat strip, okay? And he's gonna like lasagna, and he's gonna kick a dog off a table, and he's gonna be mean to his owner. Got it, send it to press. Like, I've never done that.
I make comics for my peers.
So one of the things I want to talk about real quick is, with June, what I've said before and what I'm going to say again, is we are about removing a lot of invisible roadblocks. And one of the roadblocks is you have to eat, right?
Yeah.
And there, like we've talked a lot about the sort of forced invisibility. If you feel invisible, it's much harder to go out and be like, I know my peers are out there, I'm gonna find them. So what I strive to do is make sure that people are connecting and seeing their audience and knowing that if they want to make this thing, they can, and that the decision about like, maybe I'll take a little extra time off work to make my comic becomes easier if you know there's an audience there. It's much harder if you have to choose between eating and shouting into a void. Like that's a tough decision because you want to do it. You make comics because you're compelled to, but you are still a human being that needs to exist.
But I think that we've seen a lot of examples out there of people who just say, I'm going to do this thing because it's a thing that I like. And there's always a lot of people who, it turns out, like the same thing, right? Like, I guarantee you, no matter how different everybody in this room is, we all have certain touch points that we will all agree on and be like, oh yes, I also love Doctor Who, or whatever it is, right? Like, there's a million touch points. So if you dig it, there's a good chance somebody else digs it. And I think that's the big difference between when you're doing something that's more independent versus what we've talked about here, where you have a big corporation that is saying that is not our audience that we sell to, because that's what we've identified as our corporate edict.
Yeah, let me add a little footnote to what Paul's talking about. The most guaranteed way to have a failed book is to say, I'm going to do something that I know people like. And you're going to be competing against 30, 50, 1,000 people, all looking at the market first, and then trying to tailor it so it's the book that obviously would appeal to those people. On the other hand, if you look at inside what you want and say, what is the book that I want to read that no one's making right now? Even if it sounds like a very, very small niche market in traditional terms, no one else is making it. And that's where you're going to find something that either is going to find its own market because there's other people out there who wanted that thing, they didn't even realize it possibly, but they want it, and they can finally have it. Or on the other hand, if you do fail, at least you made something you believe in.
I just wanted to say really quick, as an independent creator, one of the things I tell people is find your audience. Not that you have an audience or, grow your audience, find your audience. Because you actually have an advantage as an independent operator or a small-time operator, which is if you can find 1,000 people that like your work, you have a career. You don't need millions of people to love you. If you want to Google it later, there is a theory called the 1,000 True Fans theory. And what it functions under is if you can find 1,000 people willing to spend $100 on you every year, you can live happily, comfortably, at a level that could easily support an American average-sized family. And it was originally applied to musicians, but it can apply to anyone. And of course, it doesn't have to literally be 1,000 people. It could be 2,000 people willing to spend $50 a year or something like that. And it's what I think about every time I see a Kickstarter or I see a Patreon, because it's like 1,000 true fans in action. And you're not Marvel, you're not DC. You're not sinking $10 million into a cartoon. You're not sinking $150 million into a movie where you have to make global returns to get back in the black. No, you just need to find 1,000 people who will like you and spend money on you.
Yeah, if you... Sorry, go ahead.
We're actually coming up to the end of our time, so Isaiah, go ahead and say what you're going to say, and then we'll take one more question, and then we'll be done.
As an artist, you want to have your voice out there. When there's something that you want to express and you feel passionate about it, you just want to do it. And there's a lot of power in that. And when I started Crackers and White Wine, I just had this feeling where I was angry and I wanted to smash white supremacy, and I didn't really care about what anybody thought about it at the time. But I was still apprehensive about putting the first few strips out there, because here I am already making Transaltown, this very friendly story about a little vampire kid. And that's what I was known for at the time. It's like, what are people going to think about this new voice? And I put it out there, and people liked it. And so your audience is out there, even if you're just doing something for yourself, if it's just a personal voice and it's something that you want to share. That said, hold on to that power. But that said, don't be surprised if you get criticism for the things that you just want to say. But that's just part of being an artist. Your voice is going to be important to you, but you're going to hear some things about it sometimes.
speaking to the point of authenticity and finding something that that you're not necessarily making because you think, oh, there's this huge audience for it, but this is a story that I want to tell. Something that I have picked up on is every once in a while something will get announced that has a rainbow-colored cast and is pitched as, oh, it's so inclusive, oh, it's so diverse, and it's written by a white middle-aged man with a beard. That's an obvious red flag for me. But for the panel, what is it that sends up those red flags for you about authenticity of voice, where people are not necessarily trying to be inclusive, trying to be diversity conscious, but instead are using us as as a marketing bullet point?
When a white male creator decides it's time to do an important and powerful comic, and it takes place in like the Jim Crow South or something like that, and
So it's very specific. I love where you're going with this.
what could I possibly be talking about? But it's honestly, it's not even just stuff like that. It kind of feels like when every once in a while there's an actor in Hollywood who looks at his mantle and decides it's high time I got an Oscar. So he looks through the scripts he's sent and he finds the powerful, important movie to act in. And when largely white male creators start working on their powerful, important book, it doesn't have to be about Jim Crow American South, but that's, if I can be frank, I feel like diversity, in air quotes, is kind of like the flavor of the month in the comics industry, and it's the hot topic. So the guy who decides it's high time he won an Eisner is going to do his Jim Crow era South book, or his Warsaw Ghetto book, or Amistad retelling or some shit like that. And I don't care for those kinds of stories, and when it's clear this is the important, meaningful work, and the cast is the creators are as white can be, and if, for example, a black person was doing this story about black people, or a Jew descended from, European Jews who came over after the Holocaust was doing this book about the Warsaw Ghetto, it would get maybe a quarter of the attention, and not nearly so much the push that it gets, and like the rewards that white men reap for telling minority stories because there's this attitude. They didn't have to do that, they're just so open-minded, isn't that nice of them? Kind of turns my stomach.
That reminds me of recently, I forget the name of the actor, but there was that movie, The Danish Girl, which is about the first first trans surgery. And the actor was like, I'm so glad that we brought awareness to the trans community. It's just like, but just to get a little Marxist for a minute, I think that it's all about the means of production. It's who's in charge, who's getting the money, who has the money, who has the power to greenlight things. I think that's what's really important, and when diversity is just limited to the characters on a page, I think that's when it plays false.
The next time you see a comic or movie or a TV show, and it's about an incredibly unfortunate, disgusting, violent, reprehensible thing white supremacy did, one of my favorite things to do is to look for, like, You're Out. The character who is the white guy, by the way, this happened in Avatar too. The white guy who is sort of the safe haven for the audience, the white guy who has weirdly 21st century values in 1938 Europe or 1960 Alabama. The white guy for all the white people watching this to agree with and find succor with, because, no, don't lynch that guy, lynching's bad. And all the white people are like, yes, no, don't put those Jews on that train. Yes, that is what I would have said.
You know what? Even if you don't have a red flag, a lot of times the messages are very, very, very pandering. So if your red flags don't go off, you have a bullshit sense, and you can tell when you've been pandered to.
And I think you can. Everything's going to grow and change, and what's acceptable now won't be acceptable in 10 years.
Yeah.
So just keep reading cogent criticism and keeping your eyes out for the future, because I know for myself, I've made mistakes,
Oh, sure.
and I'm okay to own up to those because it means I can do better in the future, and I hope that we can all attempt that.
Anyone who will try and hold things you've said or done in the past that you now know far better than to say or do against you are probably babies. They are probably 15-year-old white girls in the suburbs who have never actually lived an independent life yet and have never put a foot wrong yet, so they don't actually know what it's like to screw up, recognize you screw up, and try to do better. Just so you know, awareness and inclusiveness and progressiveness is not a contest. It's not a Madonna whore thing where if you say one unfortunate thing in an interview 15 years ago, and suddenly you can never be seen as progressive again. And anyone who thinks it does, that's also a red flag.
Yeah.
So we're at the end of our time. I'm sorry to call a close to this as the oppressive white man. To quiet your voices.
Provisionally white.
But I do want to thank y'all for being awesome. This has been an amazing panel, and I feel like maybe we all learned a little something here today. And I think if you want to have conversations with anybody here to get into this more in depth, come find people at their tables, hang out, look at their books.
Should we each say our table numbers?
Yeah, sure. Everybody say your table number. I'm 45.
I'm just walking around.
I'm 78 over in the annex.
43A.
I am either 48 or 49. I think I'm 48. I have 2 books left. Sorry.
I'm 46, I believe, which is
So if you're 46, I must be 40.
I think you're 48.
We're over in the dark corner of the hot room.
What are all you people doing in my common industry?